Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 9, where we talk mostly about cultural humility. Welcome to our final online session of the course. Hopefully, this format has worked mostly okay for people. We've obviously had to make some adjustments, but I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. So, with that said, let's get started. This week is, I think I emailed this, but I'm not positive. A little bit longer than some of the others, primarily because there's a slightly longer video and a short reading embedded. So, you know, buckle in and or pause whenever you need to. All right, let's go. So, this week what we're talking about is cultural humility. And the reading that I gave you was about, mostly looking at medical contexts. So, their definition that I edited to not make about medical context was it's a lifelong commitment to self evaluation and critique, to redressing the power imbalances in interpersonal dynamics, and developing mutually beneficial and non paternalistic partnerships. So basically, it's the willingness to um, recognize that your knowledge is inherently limited because of the experiences that you haven't had. So, therefore, not assuming that you know best in a situation, um, and really trying to let go or put on hold the pieces that you feel confident in a situation, the things that you think you know about someone else in particular, um, and trusting that someone else is the expert in their own life, and that the only way that you can form a true relationship with someone that's across a power imbalance is with openness and the willingness to ask questions that come from a place of honesty rather than coming with prejudgment. So we'll talk a little more about that because I think that it's a sort of complicated balance for sure. So, but first, before we get there, I feel like cultural competence is what we hear about so much, right? So I wanted to just briefly um, go over what cultural competence is technically. And so Diller and Moule, who wrote the main cultural competence book for teachers, which is just called Cultural Competence, a primer for educators. Primer? Either way. Their definition in that is cultural competence is the ability to successfully teach students who come from cultures other than our own. It entails developing certain personal and interpersonal awareness and sensitivities, developing certain bodies of cultural knowledge, and mastering a set of skills that, taken together, underlie effective cross cultural teaching. And depending on what you're reading, there's either 4 or 5 basic cultural competence skill areas, but the fifth is actually included within the fourth. It's just sort of like a sub point. So I used the 5 because I think that it breaks things down a little better. So the first skill area is valuing diversity. So accepting and respecting various sort of cultural backgrounds and customs, different ways of communicating, different traditions, different values, and integrating all of that into the work that we're doing, into our programs, our policies, our services, and also just recognizing that a person who is, for example, Latinx may have needs as an individual, but also have needs as part of a cultural group, right? The next is conducting a cultural self assessment or being culturally self aware, is the other way it gets talked about. So, recognizing that your own culture and each of our own cultures, um, our experiences, our backgrounds, our knowledge, our skills, our beliefs, our values, our interests, um, all those things sort of shape our sense of who we are, how we fit into our worlds, and how we interact with students. And so recognizing sort of the assumptions and biases that come along with that, and recognizing uh, what we can do to reduce those barriers. Next is managing the dynamics of difference. It's also uh, phrased some places as like understanding the dynamics of cultural interactions. So in these, it's about proactively managing them rather than waiting until sort of issues arise, and improving interactions across cultures in those ways, and recognizing, knowing what those factors might be, getting a sense of historical cultural experiences, relationships between cultures in a local community. Um, and then there's acquiring and institutionalizing cultural knowledge. So, like, um, really integrating this into all the elements of the work that we're doing, designing the services based on this understanding of cultures, and making sure that then we can adapt to diversity and cultural contexts, and that the information's embedded. It's not an afterthought, it's not a specific thing because this one person has such different needs. It's across from bottom to top, top to bottom, in every piece of the work that we're doing in our districts, in our schools, in our classrooms, in the practices, in the behaviors. All of those pieces um, sort of are proactively structured to support people across cultural difference, needs, strengths, etc. So, the major difference between cultural competence and cultural humility is really the question of like, is competence possible? Do you like reach a point where suddenly you know the things you need to know and you're like, phew, all set, culturally competent? Um, can you really understand all the dynamics? Can you really be fully culturally self aware? Some of those pieces, um, the reason the cultural humility sort of came forward was the idea that this is sort of an unrealistic bar, right? That we can't necessarily reach a level of competence, and to say that we can, even while some of the work that it's asking us to do is really essential work, that it's also setting up a bar that we're all sort of pretty guaranteed to fail at. And that, I mean, by us, I certainly mean like myself as a white person, and um, myself as a middle class person, but I also mean that everyone has some situation in which they're in a situation of power. Almost every single person. Not quite, but pretty much anyone that is ending up in a position of power in education has something, right? Because it's not the easiest. There's a pretty high bar of entry. So asking for full competence is a lot. And that's where the idea of cultural humility comes in. So it's a recognition that this is a lifelong process and that our self reflection has to continue constantly. It's in some ways feels like a lower bar because it's not asking for perfection, but it's a higher bar because it's asking for constant work and for doing the constant work of recognizing that we're not there, and we're, we're never going to be 100% there. And that's that Hillel thing again that I've been saying since the beginning, that quote that's something like, you're not required to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it, right? That's what cultural humility is saying, that we have to just keep working at this because there are always going to be more gaps and more stumbling blocks and more questions and all of that. And I've really appreciated throughout the course of um, this class how much self-reflection people have been willing to do. And people have been reflecting on sort of your districts and your schools in general, but also on yourselves as individuals. And that's what cultural humility is asking for, is to do those reflections on all of those levels. Recognizing and challenging power imbalances. And again, this has to keep going uh, throughout. So power imbalance isn't a thing that is like one and done. We're constantly in situations with variable power, and cultural humility asks us to be looking for that power. I was joking um, before the class started. I was like, I worry I marketed this weird and that people thought they were coming to talk about like diversity and difference, but really they're coming to talk about power. And I've just been really grateful for the ways people have been willing to do that, despite whether I named things very well. And then institutional accountability. So, again, like I said, this is about you and it's about the context you're in. So, just a little more about sort of each of. So, the lifelong learning and critical self reflection. It's like we were saying, know that we don't know. Just recognize that as the baseline. There will always be things we don't know. Some of it's about individual people that we can't understand everyone's specific motivations and history and story, and some of it's about cultures that we're not ourselves a part of or that we're part of but in a different subgroup. Accepting our own limitations, where are our stumbling points, where are our sort of barriers, where do our hackles go up, and what can we do about that? But then also, there's 24 hours in a day, there's 7 days in a week. Like what are the real constraints on our time and our work? Be curious, be open to learning and sharing. A really key piece of this is being aware that there's things to learn and being interested in learning those things, not just having them be a big chore that we have to do. I this is maybe ridiculous. I always say that my empathy muscles were built and strengthened by all the celebrity gossip magazines I read as a kid. So every week, my mom would come home. This sounds ridiculous in the context of an equity class, and I hear that. My mom would come home with People magazine and The Inquirer and Star, and she and my little sister and I would read them all, and like cover to cover. And I just think that it did so much from a really young age by taking these people who were so fancy and so perfect and like humanizing them and their breaking points and like really bringing them down to this human scale for me and being like, oh wow, that person just relapsed. Oh wow, that person's child is really sick. Like really recognizing, as I look at someone, I'm never going to know these things, right? And cultural humility is not about having more empathy for super millionaires in Hollywood, but it is about that same piece of, okay, what do I know that I'm not going to figure out? Like where does empathy come into this? Because I would say that both building empathy and recognizing the limitations to that is pretty key to cultural humility. Holding ourselves accountable, recognizing where we've made errors, where we're continuing to make errors, and owning it. We don't need to be experts on everything else. We need to recognize that we're not going to be an expert on another culture, that we can be a like willing and joyful and interested learner. And then we're never going to stop learning, right? I guess that's part of the definition of lifelong learner. So really recognizing and challenging power imbalances. So that goes in all sorts of directions. So when we're in a position of power, that we are able to name it and that we're able to work to neutralize it. And this means cultural power in terms of being in a position of power with regard to race, with regard to sexual orientation, with regard to class, etc., with regard to ability, or being in a position of power, um, like we were saying in the article, of a doctor versus a patient, of a teacher versus a student. But then also recognizing systemic power differentials. Um, how are our districts set up? How are our schools set up? How is our voting system set up? Um, Pointing it out and pushing back. And realizing that there are always going to be power differentials that we don't see because they've gotten so normalized in our lives and our worlds. And part of cultural humility is if someone else is like, wow, that's broken, that before we're like, no, it's not, even if that's our instinct, to recognize we don't know what we don't know, and we listen and we take a breath, or maybe take a day. I try to use a rule where if someone tells me that something is unjust and I don't see it, that I try to wait 24 hours before responding, because my instinct is to be like, no, it's not, it's fine. I would see if there was something wrong, but I probably wouldn't, right? Because we've all been taught not to. So I try to wait a beat, which for me is a day, and really think about it, not spending that time trying to like form my counter argument, but trying to think with myself, what would things look like if this were true? What would things look like if this weren't true? Just to try to really to recognize that I don't know what I don't know. And institutional accountability, cultural humility. If one person is trying to practice it, I think probably most of us have at some point been, for example, in like a pretty toxic work culture where people are trying to like throw other people under the bus. And if we're trying to be like, I can't know what I can't know, I can ask questions, I can be open, I can leave space, I can trust that people are experts in their own lives. If the culture is not set up for that, it actually is pretty hard to enact because of the sort of like level of guardedness you have to feel in that sort of environment. So, for both personal and cultural reasons, having this happen on an institutional level is really important. And also, a piece of this is making sure that we are holding institutions accountable for their roles in perpetuating power imbalances. So there's this video that I'd love you to watch. Actually, it turns out that the person who is speaking in it went to my high school a couple years before me. So it felt like an extra great video to show everyone, but I really appreciate the way she frames a lot of this. So I will ask you to pause this and go watch Juliana Mosley speak on cultural humility. This is a longer video. It's, I think, like 16 or 17 minutes. So if you don't have time now, come back to it before you move on in the PowerPoint. Okay, great. Okay, moving on. So I think to me this question of cultural humility is interesting and important on an individual level, but like I was saying, um, is also really important when we think about how our schools are structured, both on a district level, um, and on an individual school level, and also on a state and federal level, honestly. And so I just want to ask you to um, keep that question in your mind as you read this article. It's short. Um, it is called People See Black Kids as Less Innocent and Less Young Than White Kids. And I believe I actually listed this as a supplemental reading earlier in the class, but I really want everyone to read it and think about it in the context of what we were just talking about. So I will again give you a second to pause this and head over and do that. Okay, so the question that I want to ask you to think about for this, your final reflection, is I want to think about race specifically now, going back to that, is thinking about how this all fits together. Think about the suspension rates you looked up early in the semester. Think about the piece you read from The Guardian about black black students um, sort of being seen as more likely to be troublemakers. Think about this article we just read about people seeing black kids as less innocent, and think about cultural humility and implicit bias, and how do these work together and how do they challenge each other? How can we have, um, like, what does cultural humility truly look like when we're also thinking about the implicit bias that we're already bringing to things? I don't need you to answer every single sub question of that, but when you hear all of those questions, like, what comes up for you? What sort of resonates, or where do you feel challenged or pushed or worried or hopeful or ready to move forward? So that's your last reflection. Thank you all so much, and I will see you next week.